Welcome, everybody. Hope you all had a nice weekend. I'm delighted. Oh, by the way, if any of you took the makeup exam, they've now been scored, and they can be picked up from Ashley Gearhart, the teaching fellow in the front row, and she'll be available after class for you to pick those up. I'm really delighted today to introduce our guest lecturer, Professor Rogan Kirsch from New York University. Rogan is Associate Dean at the Wagner School at New York University and a highly esteemed national and internationally visible figure in the field of political science. You may have seen Rogan on TV, heard him on the radio, because he's very often interviewed about politics in general. In fact, it's interesting to talk to him about what's going to happen tomorrow in the election. But more pertinent to today's topic, Rogan has been one of the first people from political science to pay attention to the issue of obesity, and has written some very thought-provoking pieces, some very insightful pieces, one of which is in your required readings, about the issue of obesity, giving it a historical view that nobody else had taken before, and placing it in not only historic but political context, which is so important. And as you know from our discussions in the class, politics play a major role in nutrition policy, what foods people have access to, global trade policies, and the like. So understanding the political environment and how it affects problems like nutrition and obesity are very important. And Rogan, as I said, has a view of this that nobody else has, and is an incredibly insightful scholar on this topic. Rogan received his undergraduate training at Wake Forest University, then came to Yale University, where he received his PhD in political science. He spent several years back at Yale as a Robert Wood Johnson Scholar. He then joined the faculty at Syracuse University, where he was on the faculty for a number of years, taught very popular undergraduate and graduate classes in political science, and more recently was recruited to New York University, where he teaches in the Wagner School and also is Associate Dean, as I mentioned. He's one of those people in the field who approaches these issues from a different point of view, is thoughtful, creative, and scholarly in the way he looks at them, and is wonderful in the way he communicates them. So I'm delighted that he could join us today. So let's please welcome Rogan Kirsch.
Thanks, Kelly. Like many of you, I hope someday, and like many others in this field, I've got mics all over, so I'll try to clip. I started doing this research because of Kelly Brownell. You all are enormously fortunate to have him in front of you 2 times a week, and I'm honored to be on this stage. Now, I taught here, as Kelly said, for a bunch of years, and I've continued on and off to teach. Last time I taught a class here was just 2 years ago. So I have some sense of you, I think, unless Yale students have changed. I do see a Ron Paul for President shirt. So Yale students have changed a bit since I was last here. And I have some sense of how and when you do reading. So I'm not going to have the Charlie Brown with a football assumption. You all poured over this piece of mine in great detail. You'll see it before the final at least. But I don't also want to get up here and just replicate that, just reiterate what's in that piece for those of you who did bother to go through it. So that is about what I call somewhat audaciously, I think, the new politics of healthcare and how it relates to obesity and nutrition politics. I'm going to skip those details. If any of you are fascinated, we can circle back at the end. But I want to pull back and set the broader context for what you're doing the next 3 weeks in here, including this one, the politics of food and nutrition as they relate to obesity. And I thought I'd set the stage with some of this work that Kelly was so kind to reference, this historical piece that I've spent a lot of time on. And let me start with a proposition. The United States is a nation, this is us, we the people, is a nation of individualists. We aggressively seek to protect the private sphere, our own lives, from intrusive state or government action. We're very concerned about big government meddling in our private lives. I see some of you nodding. I see some of you nodding and some of you noddling, whatever that is. So I know you get that notion. And in fact, much of our constitutional system, if you've taken any kind of con law here or basic political science, you know that much of our constitutional system turns on protecting the private sphere from intrusive state action. And yet, let us pause for a moment, roll your minds back to high school or Yale history classes, and remember the extraordinary range and number of times that the US government has been quick to leap into citizens' private lives. In fact, public officials have long taxed, regulated, prohibited, or otherwise influenced a wide range of what we think of as personal behavior. Let me start with 4 dramatic examples and then connect this to food and obesity. Some of you who grew up in this country will remember the happy little story of Johnny Appleseed and the this will come up in a moment, I think. Or not. Yeah, there it's going rolling slow. I want to talk about the triggers behind public policy making in the U.S. And I'll start with this Johnny Appleseed story. You remember Johnny Appleseed as a sort of friendly character who, in the Disney version, went around and planted apples for American children, as you heard it in grade school, to consume and grow strong and so on. Johnny Appleseed was in fact a real person, but he didn't plant apples for people to eat. He planted them for them to turn into their personal store of fermented cider, a pretty heavy-duty alcoholic drink that was the beverage of choice in most American households across the country well into the early 19th century. In the realm of alcohol consumption, there has been a long history of U.S. government moving heavily into our private, what was once considered private behavior, from the day of Johnny Appleseed, when again it was considered to be what you drank was your own business. Americans consumed far more rum than they did water well into the 19th century. Rum was considered healthier, gave you that sort of medicinal kick going down. It was only when health officials stepped in and began what actually were 5 different rounds of liquor prohibition in the U.S., the last of which was most famous, resulted in a constitutional amendment to prohibit the sale or consumption of alcohol in this country. So in the realm of alcohol consumption, we see an active American government despite this laissez-faire activity. Or consider that most personal of activities, sex. After the Civil War, both contraceptives and abortions were relatively easy to get. Abortions in this country terminated about 1 of every 5.5 pregnancies. Legal, not that difficult to get access to, no big fights about it, that's just the way it was. A great crusade, led partly by the American Medical Association, the docs organization, the AMA, drove both abortion and birth control into the American shadows, where they remained for a century. To this day, few nations contest family planning politics with anything resembling America's ferocity. Alcohol, sex. Both realms you think of as private, your business, both areas of elaborate government regulatory forms. The ferocious present-day drug wars offer another example of America's regulation of a once private activity, from the first state bans on opium in the 1870s to the contemporary anti-drug regime, complete with a powerful national drug czar. American politics again refutes, or at least qualifies, this picture we have in our heads of a individualistic, anti-government, rights-rich political culture. A couple of drug war moments. This is a 1890s advertisement, ordinary advertisement you'd see in the newspaper like you do for, I don't know, Filene's Basement today. Cocaine in your toothache drops. In fact, long before you guys got here, I got to Yale about 15 or 16 years ago, there was an exhibition in Sterling of old sort of study exhortations to students, things you guys are encouraging students to study in different ways, sort of like you take Red Bull and so on today. One of them was, Yale men, take your cocaine before your final exam. This was a perfectly ordinary form of American life at the time. Now we've got a much more active, just say no drug war kind of culture, kicked off, or at least advanced by a First Lady of the United States government, Nancy Reagan. So once again, you see this refutation of our individualistic culture. And then finally, in the last generation, in your own lifetimes, a coalition of national and state political actors have mounted a serious and sustained challenge to the tobacco industry, resulting in dramatic restraints on what maybe some of you smokers here consider your personal choice. In each of these cases, government charged into what had been considered purely private behavior. In all these spheres, other industrial, advanced democratic nations take a more laissez-faire attitude. Alcohol, sex, drugs, tobacco. In the abstract, you thought, no way. Government never interferes with our private activities. If you look at the historical record of how the U.S. government got involved with these private behaviors, I think we can learn something about obesity, nutrition, and food as a subject of public policy. I've done this kind of talk before, various audiences, from high school students to the food industry, and it's so interesting to ask them at the beginning what their impression of the U.S. government is. You're sophisticated enough, I assume you had something like this portrait of our individualistic anti-government view in your heads. It's remarkable to see how qualified it actually is. So, how did the government step in and regulate personal behavior? I'm going to take these 4 areas as an example and then connect to obesity and food politics. There's 7 triggers in the work I've done that move us from purely private, again, people drinking rum in their own households, people having sex the way they want. There's a long list of prohibited sexual behaviors. If you didn't know this, you'll have to find out someday. How do we move from purely private to subjects of public regulation? What does that mean for obesity? I'll do the 7 triggers to public policy, and then we'll circle back and look at food and nutrition. This pointer's not working, so I have to hide back here to move this along. First trigger, first 2, there you go. Social disapproval. Condemnation first stirs in society among us. At least some social groups stigmatize some private behavior. Victorian feminists condemned aggressive male sexuality and held up purity as a male ideal. Mill owners and urban elites in the 1830s worried about the disruptive effects of drinking. Social groups, we the people, begin casting judgments long before the American government moves into action. Eventually, in most cases, this social condemnation wins broad support. Second trigger is already up there too. You got a bonus 2 for 1 on this tricky little PowerPoint. Medicalization or medical science is the second trigger moving us from private to public activity. Public health crusades generally require a kind of scientific base. It's a necessary, but not by itself, condition for political action, at least in these historic examples I'm trying to give you. The science can be true. Tobacco really is harmful. The science can be partially true. Liquor contributed to health problems, but it was not poison, as prohibitionists insisted. Or the science can be entirely fictitious, as when Victorian-era physicians warned men, physicians again issuing medical warnings, that too much self-abuse, meaning masturbation, or too much sex could maim, blind, or kill them. This was a very popular cartoon from back in the day showing this poor guy who's masturbated too much. One hand's already ruined and destroyed. He's got some terrible disease from masturbation. This was medical science in the 1880s and 90s when your great-grandparents were somehow moving to create you. Medical knowledge can rapidly transform society. It can challenge everyday activities in ways that would have seemed unimaginable even a few years earlier. In our own lifetimes, in our own time, the backlash against tobacco, which was initially rooted in medical findings about its dangerous effects, has transformed the popular culture. Or once again, forgive those of you who aren't interested in history, I'm going to draw on it here and there. To reach back to a historic example, Americans at the start of the 18th century, I noted earlier, drained prodigious amounts of rum and viewed water, or avoided water, as unhealthy. As physicians began to issue warnings about the dangers of rum in the 1840s and 50s, the American consumption, the average consumption of rum plummeted, fell about 75% in just a few years. So doctors make warnings, we start to respond around behaviors we've already begun to condemn socially. The third trigger to public policy is self-help. When medical authorities issue warnings, especially about socially sinful behaviors, this is a nation of self-help movements. They spring up to encourage people to live more healthy lives. Today, you know this, America's landscape is dotted with associations dedicated to all manner of social behaviors, Alcoholics Anonymous, Smokers Anonymous, and so on. Turns out this urge is also deeply rooted in American history. In Jacksonian America, that's the late 1820s into the 30s, urban working men organized Washington temperance, meaning to be non-alcoholic, Washington temperance societies to help one another swear off liquor. Women, not to be outdone, these are the first mass organized women's political groups in United States history, though they weren't exactly political yet. They formed Martha Washington societies, the first, again, female prohibition groups. And Abraham Lincoln, no less a figure than Abraham Lincoln, gave a series of talks to Martha Washington societies trying to court what wasn't the women's vote, but at least women's influence. A couple examples of what things looked like back then. This is the Tree of Temperance from the 1840s. Towns would erect these, something like this, and then this is an old political cartoon that shows all the wonderful virtues, industry, humility, goodwill, contentment, economy, patience, all those virtues that spring from not drinking alcohol. So you see, and these are ordinary working men around the country who would erect these sort of tall poles, and this was a newspaper version of the virtues you would have come to if you just stopped drinking alcohol, kind of self-help movement again. And you got the modern version through Alcoholics Anonymous. Now, social disapproval, medical research, and self-help movements are all private sector activities, of course, but together they help move these public health issues towards the realm where politics, government starts to step in. Reformers, it's a fascinating and even somewhat disturbing feature in American life. Reformers start to become frustrated by offenders' resistance to reform. Let's all get together and swear off alcohol, they said in the 1830s. Then some people didn't. That's when they turned to government help. And when their message of uplift and self-improvement is not heard, they start to turn in a more negative direction, and that trips a couple of other triggers. So I'll take you back through these each time just to remind you where we've been, where we're going. The fourth trigger is demonization. This is a dark side of American public life. The next two triggers will both have to do with what I call demonization, meaning taking some, at least neutral or even virtuous, in this case industry or producer, and turning them into agents of the dark side. And I'll just note there's a very deep religious aspect or strain to almost all these. You'll see as I go, talking about socially sinful behaviors, demonizing, often associating with godlessness, the producers of these dangerous or evil substances. So the demon in the first case, in trigger 4, can be the industry that produces some substance. Demon rum became what all alcohol producers were referred to casually in the 19th century, or you can think of big tobacco in our own time. This is another old political cartoon showing a hearty, able young man who turns to liquor, becomes more and more distraught. Within 2 years, this political cartoon said, this young fellow turns into that. As a result of this demonic industry. This is a modern book, but that thing's on the cover. Or think of big tobacco in our own time. It wasn't that long ago that tobacco companies had a positive reputation in American life. They sponsored sports events and concerts and all kinds of positive things. Now, again, big tobacco, capital B, capital T, has this sort of ominous reference. Especially effective in these kinds of public health crusades going back 200 years nearly, especially effective is targeting a greedy industry or going after a greedy industry that targets children, unable to help themselves, luring helpless children to self-destructive habits. A contemporary case, again, is tobacco. This Joe Camel ads, you're probably shockingly a little too young to remember any of this, but there was a huge fuss in the tobacco days around Joe Camel, who was this sort of glorious icon with this, sort of cool, some 1990s version of cool, who went from this kind of icon once tobacco began to be demonized to a very different kind of figure, from Joe Camel to Joe Chemo. These charges, let me note again, can be accurate, they can be wildly exaggerated, or they can be completely false about the producers or the purveyors of whatever the substance is. What matters in American political life is that they pack real political power. And so you see us starting to move, again, in all these examples, towards a very different kind of realm. The fifth trigger, and I do this research with a fellow up at Brown, Jim Marone, and the two of us get positively depressed when we rummage back through American history and look at how this fifth trigger has seemed to be necessary, at least has been part of the story of moving us from something you do in the privacy of your own home or bedroom or wherever to a subject of public activity. The fifth trigger also has to do with demonization, but it's around demonization of users. This is, again, series of dark chapters in American history, demonization of users of these prohibited substances. And they tend to be people on the social and economic margins of American life. No surprise if you studied U.S. history. Foreigners, racial minorities, urban masses, the lower classes. An immigrant nation like this one with a steady stream of strangers never lacks for dangerous others who are easily portrayed as bringing their foreign destructive habits into American cities. In fact, the history of American drug wars can be told as a series of waves of racial and ethnic fears. Prohibitions on smoking opium, but not using liquid morphine, which was the a sort of practice of middle and upper class white women. They used to take a little nip or other forms of morphine to get through the day. Though that was continued to be fine as the drug wars began to take shape a century ago. But prohibitions on smoking opium were inspired specifically by fears of Chinese immigrants beginning in the 1870s. And you get these sort of horrifying examples. Again, I'm using popular culture examples. This is a cartoon of it's a caption something like the typical Chinese in his opium den in San Francisco. National campaign to portray Chinese as engaging in these destructive habits. They came from somewhere else. They did these bad things. Another target of this, by the way, in the drinking realm earlier was Catholics, who were considered to be degenerate, disreputable, and so on in American life. You see here the model of an indulgent, the home of an indulgent mother. This is a typical Catholic mother supposedly. Once again, you see her child, who you can't quite see all this, but begins by just playing and then has plenty of pickles and pork, the first vice. Mexicanized dishes and pepper sauces, the road to ruin, as you can see. Then down through candies and rich pastries, tea, coffee, and cocoa, sodas, pop, and ginger ale, tobacco and cigarettes, cars, dice, and pool. Finally, liquor and strong drink, and a drunkard's grave. These, again, are the kinds of foreign habits, Asian Americans, as they soon came to be in this case, Catholics in this case, who were helping to destroy the fabric of American society, the story went. The worst story, no surprise, given American history, had to do with African Americans. It was a series of cocaine panics right around a century ago, beginning in 1908, 1909, and going forward for a bit. They sprang from these sort of racist fantasies about drug-crazed black men. The New York Times, let me get this quote right, actually, I'll read it precisely. This is the New York Times, then as now the paper of record in our country, and this is a news story, not an op-ed, reporting objectively the news. I'm quoting, "Bullets fired into vital parts that would drop a sane man in his tracks," writes the Times in its news stories, "cannot slow down the Negro cocaine fiend." Once again, you see demonization of people who are engaging in these habits or practices we, the majority, consider destructive. And you see this movement towards reform. Congress's response to these cocaine panics, mostly targeting black men, the Harrison Narcotics Act of 1914, our first foray into the modern drug wars. So, demon providers and industry peddling poison, and demon users, the people who get hooked on these practices, usually, again, folks on the margins of American society. These fears become widespread and lead to trigger 6. Social movements or mass movements in American life. Activists, you and me, organized and mobilized to act politically, can cut through barriers to political action by seizing the attention of policymakers. When small groups of women began kneeling in prayer outside saloons in the 1870s, praying loudly as men went past them on their way, they were brushed aside by men eager to get their lunchtime or even breakfast, beer, rum, etc. When the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the WCTU, got 200,000 to 300,000 women involved in fighting liquor consumption, one of the first major mass movements in the United States, or indeed any country's history. And let me just note, lots of places have people who rise up in the streets and tear things down and build barricades. A social or mass movement has a different character. It's organized. It's relatively peaceful. It's people moving in enormous numbers trying to bring about some kind of political or social change. Think Million Man March in our modern times. It's interesting, by the way, that the mass movement has begun to fade a bit. We look more at sort of litigation, class action lawsuit strategies today. But there still are occasionally mass movements that come together around changing some aspect of American behavior. And the interesting piece is the last two, the two most current I can think of in American history, have both been all male. The Million Man March and the sort of Promise Keepers movement, where stadiums full of 70, 80, 90, 100,000 men, almost entirely men, vow to be more respectful to their families, to seize this sort of manly head of the family kind of status and so on. It's an interesting kind of moment we're in American history. But back in the day, around these various issues, mass movements would rise up, as in this example, around liquor consumption and so on. So to finish the thought, when small groups of women kneeled in prayer, swept aside, or knelt in prayer, when 200,000 to 300,000 women marched together, then their leaders were welcomed into meetings with top policymakers in Washington. 7 states passed alcohol prohibitions, and 14 more considered them in response to WCTU agitation, and the stirrings of federal prohibition began. Once more, a historical piece. This ran all over the country back then. Woman's Holy War, it says. Grand charge, and goes on through the anti-alcohol army. And you can see in the name of God and humanity, the Temperance League, all these rum, brandy, gin, whiskey barrels being shattered by this brave form of woman, representing this, again, hundreds of thousands of women joined together in opposition to liquor and alcohol. Mass movements trigger political action. They overcome entrenched bureaucracy or entrenched industry power, like tobacco and breweries, and also move us past, bless you, the inertia built into American politics. The war on drugs, interestingly, the one that existed more or less in your lifetimes, never quite made it to the movement stage, although there were many carefully staged events that tried to suggest that. This was an infamous moment where journalists were invited to see an enormous anti-drug rally. So the claim went, and there were a big American flag, and for some reason the Air Force had a plane there. I guess they were going to fly into your living room and stop you on drugs. But it turned out that almost everybody there had been bussed in, or it wasn't a group of people rising up spontaneously to stop drugs. But there's all kinds of details and aspects around this. Part of the reason that the drug war never quite got to social movement phase is people pushed back. This is actually a anti-drug war, or I guess you could say pro-drugs in some sense, at least anti-heavy-duty laws against marijuana group trying to suggest that you're a victim, not a beneficiary of this so-called war. Movements, let me note, do not define or promote concrete policies. They organize, they mobilize, but until we get to the last stage, the last of these 7 triggers, you don't see actual political result. Interest group action is our 7th and final trigger to political action. Cultural images, again, like big tobacco and mass movements win political attention, but it's interest groups that frame issues and policy solutions. They translate popular energy into a political plan. This process involves taking this general dissatisfaction, all these ingredients, medical warnings and self-help groups and these terrible demonization movements and the rise of mass politics. Interest groups skillfully take all that and turn it into a kind of blueprint, a set of specific complaints and detailed policy proposals. In the anti-alcohol struggle, the WCTU, again, Women's Christian Temperance Union, they got the attention. But it was a much smaller and little-known group called the Anti-Saloon League, the ASL, that got prohibition through the US Congress. I'll just note, as someone who does research on lobbying, forgive this lapse into political science for a moment, but the Anti-Saloon League practically defined the modern interest group. It was one of the first political science studies of interest groups. It was a now classic monograph from the 1920s analyzing the ASL's success as an interest group in moving prohibition through Congress's then as now complicated channels and achieving this remarkable constitutional amendment that, again, banned sale, production of alcohol for 15 years in American life. Instead of mobilizing people around the country, the League hired lawyers and lobbyists. Instead of demonstrations, it sponsored legislation. Even the name Anti-Saloon League suggests a kind of narrow, no-nonsense objective. So, 7 triggers. Social disapproval of private behavior, medicalization or medical science, self-help, demonization of industry and its users, demonization of individuals, or mass movements, interest group action. This is not a recipe to be followed. For those of you advocates, and especially in the public health realm out there who want to make something public, it doesn't necessarily work this way, but historically it's remarkable how we've seen these triggers more or less in sequence over a period of time, establishing real regimes of political regulation, again, prohibition and so on, in alcohol, drugs, sex, and tobacco realms. Where does this leave us on food? I'm now going to spend the next 20 minutes or so taking us through obesity and nutrition along each of these 7 trigger lines, and then wrap up and we can take questions or battle this through as you like. Social disapproval of, in this case, obesity and overeating of fatty foods. This is a fascinating chapter in U.S. history, and I don't know how much in the early part of this course you got into how obesity and overweight became a kind of sin in American life, but research I did on that was some of the most interesting historical research I've done in a long time. I know for many of you the words interesting historical research sound like an oxymoron, but there it is. It was once desirable to be what used to be called well-formed, corpulent, pleasingly plump in American life. Well into actually through the 19th century into the early 20th century, thinness was associated with illness in the United States and in fact many other advanced industrial countries at the time. Around the turn of the 20th century, and I've done research, as have others, to try to pinpoint when we go through what's a pretty remarkable cultural shift in American life from it's actually desirable to be large or well-formed, again, as the term went back then. It's a sign of wealth. It's a sign of, in some cases, higher education. Again, if you're thin, you're diseased, you're sick, you're poor, something's wrong with you. Right around the turn of the 20th century, nobody's gotten this exactly, but there's about a 5 to 10 year period where social mores, society, just shifts on this. And there's some reasonably good research, but nobody's nailed why. I'd be fascinated if some of you have read or done work, or even this class has taken up the details, but nobody's nailed why we change the way we do. But it changes dramatically, and obesity becomes a topic of disapproval. I did a lot of magazine research around this, so I looked in popular magazines, you know, the Time or Newsweek or, I don't know, Elle and so on of the day. I looked in those to see the shifts in advertisements and stories, and you can really track it. You see advertisements for Catholic statuary, for example. Catholics would buy statues of saints to put in their yards or in their homes. And up until about 1905, 1906, right in there, the statues of saints are all large. Mother Mary is a fairly large figure in American homes in this period, no pun intended, both large in context. And then all of a sudden, these statues get really skinny. Same saints, more or less the same figures, and yet they've changed. Living Age magazine, which was a very popular sort of women's ladies' home journal, which you haven't heard of, but someday you women in the group will probably subscribe to. The version of that in the early 1900s was something called Living Age, and I'm going to read this quote exactly. They wrote in an editorial. This is not just some random comment. This is them editorializing, telling young and middle-aged mothers of the time how to live their lives, basically. Fat, this wrote, is now regarded as an indiscretion and almost as a crime. You can also trace this change, other interesting ways of tracking it, are through shifts in common language. Big insult, there's a historian who actually traces major insults that mostly young people give each, playground, high school, those kinds of exchanges. Around the late 1890s, early 20th century, you see for the first time in currency the most popular insults, as best as these researchers can tell, were things like jumbo, butterball, fat slob. Never before traced or noted in American history. All of a sudden, these all come into vogue in the early 20th century. You don't need me to tell you that Americans' prejudices against obese and, in some cases, even moderately overweight people remain extremely powerful, affecting everything from personal self-esteem to college acceptance and hiring decisions. Obesity is regularly termed an epidemic in popular and scientific journals. You can read, again, to quote the New York Times, they've had a whole series called The Fat Epidemic. And you even casually scan TV listings these days. If they're not about the bailout, they're still about things like the obesity epidemic. So the first trigger for perhaps 100 years has been tripped, so to speak, in American life around obesity. Medicalization. Interestingly, doctors viewing the medical industry, such as it was back then, viewing overweight and obesity as a problem, lagged well behind this social turn against obesity and overweight. Doctors still saw obese patients as pleasingly plump. That was an official medical term from a Journal of the American Medical Association. Into the 1920s. And only in the 1950s was obesity fully, what we might say, medicalized with terms like obesity or adipose. So much of what you've read in here stems from medical findings that really start in the 1950s, 50 or so years after the initial social turn against obesity and overweight. Nonetheless, this trigger, I think we can say, has fairly been tripped. Self-help. As physicians began to classify obesity as a medical problem, a whole range of private associations developed to combat obesity and overweight. Many of these centered, I want to tie back to this religious point again, many of these centered around moral disapproval of the condition of overweight or obesity. Overeaters Anonymous was founded in 1960 and modeled explicitly on the quasi-religious Alcoholics Anonymous. I have a brochure I meant to bring for this, but couldn't find it in my many boxes. I still haven't quite moved into NYU after 2 years. In my many boxes last night, but there's a brochure from one of the first Overeaters Anonymous meetings, and it promises you, the potential attendant, that they will allow members to confess your eating sins and receive approval and absolution for your commitment and for your actual weight loss. Listen to those words: sins, approval, absolution. Those are, again, from our extremely powerful religious strain in American public life. So these triggers seem, to me at least, doing this research, well tripped. The others, less certain. Let's go through the rest and see how obesity might have moved, again, from a subject of private, the food we eat, from a private realm into a public or political realm. On demonization, both of industry and users, hard to fix this exactly. Since I started studying the subject under Kelly's guidance 8 or so years ago, you couldn't find a lot of demonization in the popular culture of the industries purveying this. In fact, one of the first examples I found was a parody where Rush Limbaugh, yes, that Rush Limbaugh, a Ron Paul supporter perhaps, listens to Rush occasionally. Rush Limbaugh, I happened to hear him on July 4th, 2001, in which he did a kind of, Rush-style rant, in this case targeting, he was very upset about the tobacco settlement, and he was complaining about the next target, he said in a kind of parody, is going to be big food. And let me actually give you the quote. He again predicts a kind of demonization. He meant ironically, it turned out somewhat to happen. The next target of nanny state reformers, Rush said, and let me just parenthetically note that Rush is part of a group that awards the Nanny of the Year to the person they believe to be the most interfering with Americans' robust private sphere. Your own Professor Kelly Brownell was the Nanny of the Year, what, 2003, 2002? Previous awardees include, yes. The previous year's awardee was Bill Clinton, so he's in good company. Limbaugh said the next target of nanny state reformers is going to be food. You're going to have to find big food, big fat, or whoever and blame them and make someone pay. Now Limbaugh's exaggerating, but I think it's possible to note a kind of trend towards the demonization of industry. I actually have a couple of research assistants at NYU who are going back systematically since 2001 and looking through popular culture references to find the turn from McDonald's being this friendly, happy clown to something much more ominous and dangerous. There's some interesting examples that some of you may have seen in here. And some of the main points or the main moments in this cultural shift, I think, this movement towards demonization have been things like the movie Super Size Me, a famous documentary, for a while the biggest grossing documentary in American history, or Eric Schlosser's classic muckraking track, Fast Food Nation, which, thinking back to children, argues that a cynical industry, I'm quoting now, targets children, reshapes their eating habits, and finds that hugely profitable, Schlosser writes, to increase the size and fat content of children's portions. He then concludes that, in this Fast Food Nation book, that the food industry has literally sponsored an epidemic and writes no other nation in history has gotten so fat so fast. Bizarrely, to me at least, that fascinating and important piece of nonfiction got made into a movie, which was not a particularly good one. But there you see popular culture beginning to shift its imagery. And the particular, one of the particular subjects I have one of my research assistants looking at is how Ronald McDonald, this icon of happy, friendly clown, started to turn more sinister to the point that at one time Ronald McDonald was the single most recognized figure on the planet, living, fake, whatever, of any kind of creature. This is 10 or 15 years ago. And now McDonald's has almost entirely removed him from their advertising because he's been successfully, if not quite demonized, at least turned into a more dangerous figure in the eyes of children by some advocates who have sought to portray Ronald as a dangerous figure. Again, I suspect you get some of this popular culture, or lots of it, in this class. I just want to note that what you may be seeing is this kind of movement to demonization that has predicted political action in so many other cases in American history. How about demonization of users? Here again, we're on complicated ground. I don't think we see overweight or obese people as genuinely dangerous to society on the order of drug-using criminals or smokers polluting their surroundings with secondhand toxins. You do hear concerns, and I spent a fair bit of time on this in the article that you may or may not have read for today. You do hear concerns about the economic costs of people who can't control their self-destructive appetites, as it's often put, and get themselves sick, as it's also often put, and then cost us as a nation, you and me, the taxpayers, some figure that gets bounced around, but is sometimes currently estimated at around $120 billion a year in excess health costs owing to overconsumption. So to me, there's at least a hint, a seismic tremor of something like demonization of users in the increasingly widespread editorials and op-eds suggesting, this again is not stuff that we political scientists read, this is what you're reading in the papers. And I actually have done a kind of viral marketing study where you can trace a single editorial, a single op-ed that ran in the Baltimore Sun about 3 years ago, suggesting that something like the economic cost of obesity is everyone's business. It's in the piece you all read. You can see this piece spread. USA Today picked it up. In the end, over 100 different newspapers and other media outlets ran a version of this. So you can see this notion that that person there, due to their overeating and self-destructive appetitive practices, is costing me money. This is at least the edge of a kind of demonization of the users. And what about the social movements piece? Again, you don't see people marching in the streets to stop M&M's or McDonald's or so on.
And I think also absent all-out demonization of big food or consumers of it, sustained popular movements against overweight have not coalesced in American society. Despite a century of disapproval and failed diets, obesity politics doesn't stir anything remotely resembling the WCTU's marches against alcohol or even the Just Say No anti-drug crusades. But again, and this is something I explore in the paper, take it through with you guys if you want, we live in a somewhat different age. We're not as prone to take to the streets around political action as earlier generations of Americans were. The modern variant may be, and the tobacco case shows us this, the modern variant of social action, mass social action, may actually be legal action, litigation, particularly mass torts, where in a class action suit, many affected people come together and seek monetary remand. And there's lots of interesting examples. I'll just flag this for you now as a possible example of social movement, so to speak, around obesity. Lots of examples of class action or even individual case lawsuits being brought against the food industry. The piece you, again, may or may not have read suggests that the judiciary, the courts, may actually be the locus of major action in this area as opposed to our elective branches of government, the executive, i.e. White House, or down at the state level, governors and so on, and legislative branches. It's an interesting, and I try to suggest in my piece, a kind of historic shift in the way we make politics, literally, the way we make policy in this country, from members of Congress and elected presidents and their supporters in the executive branch, from them being the locus of major policy change to the courts being the locus of major policy change. Again, I'm happy to take that up if you like later. There's some real concerns that things that happen in courts, policies that actually take place in courts, don't last that long. They don't endure as powerfully as a law that is made by the representatives of we the people. But nonetheless, it is an interesting possible shift and may herald the kind of change in obesity politics as well. And then finally, interest group politics. This is still only stirring, I would say. The anti-tobacco movement attracted a large number of very well-financed organizations that sought to really reshape the landscape, eventually successfully, of what happened with smoking and tobacco. In the obesity or pro-nutrition, let's say, realm, there's a smaller number of groups and they don't have as much funding yet. You see that starting to change, and again, I gesture to both the folks in the front row here who come from Yale's own Rudd Center, and I'm sure you've heard lots and lots of details and aspects of that. This is one of a handful of groups that is really moving towards trying to make a difference in nutrition and overweight. One encouraging thing, so interest group action, people actually fanning out across Capitol Hill to bring about major changes in American diet or otherwise try to affect policies that would change the way we eat or change the way the food industry markets or portion sizes, lots of different possibilities we can get to. But actual interest group action here has been smaller than we saw in these other cases I described. One encouraging aspect of that, I'll say, is that groups like the Rudd Center, or Center for Science in the Public Interest, also one of the well-known groups in this area, have been much more nuanced in the politics. You don't see the kind of demonization, the kind of stigma of the very people that they're ostensibly trying to help in this nutrition, overweight, obesity politics realm. I find that an encouraging aspect of peace. At the same time, you don't see the kind of big interest group push that has, the past is only a guide, it's not a blueprint to the future, but that has always been the hallmark of major change in American life around public health. So, 3 triggers tripped for sure for many years. Something that looks like the beginnings of, if not demonization, at least real criticism of the food industry for its practices. Happily, not yet something as profound as demonization of users. No mass movement. People aren't marching in the streets around this, but again, if you'll accept that mass litigation, mass tort, again, class action lawsuits may be a substitute, those are beginning to take shape. There's some interesting legal work done in this realm that you'll hear about in the next actually 2 weeks. Next week, I guess, is when Stephen Tourette is in here. You'll hear from an expert in this realm. And then interest group action. Again, brave action by some folks, including people in the front row here, but only nascent and stirring, I'd say. I should also note that opponents of government action are always going to try to keep these issues off the policy agenda. Tobacco was a remarkably successful industry for 30 or 40 years in blunting or blocking action, and the food industry, as either you've heard in here or you certainly will, has been very successful so far at blocking or blunting regulatory activity. sometimes in open, active interest group ways, sometimes more subtle. I learned this actually from Kelly or Marlene, I can't remember which, but there's a conference of the North American Association for the Study of Obesity, NASO, a meeting that those of us who do this research go to most years. And until quite recently, this premier medical and public policy gathering to discuss issues related to obesity and overweight, until quite recently, the sponsors of that meeting were Hershey, Kraft, Coke, and SlimFast. So you can see ways in which the very people doing this research have at least some support and encouragement from those in the industry to see things these ways. Okay, enough history lessons. I'm happy to talk for what is a relatively short time remaining about what government might do to regulate high-fat, low-nutrition foods, mandate exercise, and so on. Let me leave you with this thought. Actually, I'll leave you with two thoughts. The first one is a simple, straightforward one. When I arrived at Yale in 1988 to start my graduate program, exactly 20 years ago this fall, I had 4 graduate seminars in political science, ordinary kinds of seminars, small in this case, ones that those of you who take college seminars have had classes this size, in classrooms in some cases where you all have sat and had seminars. In 3 of those 4 classes, the professor and many of the students smoked all the way through class. Shocking, outrageous, astonishing. I always imagine 25 years from now talking to a group like this and saying 45 years ago, or 20 years ago when I was at Yale, students used to eat in class M&Ms, drink Coke, and the students would look just as amazed at the idea that your predecessors, your elder siblings, as it were, at Yale, used to smoke in class. It was a regular thing here. Nobody thought it was odd at all. I was an anti-smoker type myself. I never had smoked. But the idea that my professors, 3 of 4 smoked, no big deal at all. That's one thought to leave you with, the way things change remarkably. Go back 100 years, not at all unusual for all of you to take a little snort or sip of something like cocaine before you prepared. Shocking, horrifying, professors suggesting these things. The world changes, sometimes swiftly and so often profoundly and dramatically. So one aspect of obesity and food politics could be a kind of regulatory prohibition that you couldn't even imagine as you sit in these seats today. Let me finish with a more sermon-y kind of thought. In the realm of public approaches to private problems, that's what we've been talking about today, as I hope you've gathered by now. Public, i.e. government approaches to what is considered private problems. It's where a lot, as my article tried to suggest, it's where a lot of the action is in health politics and policy today. We've moved in this regulating private behavior direction in a way we did not used to do in American life. Used to be big public programs that occupied health advocates and activists. Hill-Burton, which established all the wonderful network of once wonderful network of public hospitals and clinics around the country. Medicare, Medicaid, big public programs. Now we target in our health policy and politics making private behaviors, from asbestos and tobacco to perhaps food and the conditions it inspires. So in the realm of public approaches to private problems, the lesson from one policy area after another, alcohol, drugs, sex, tobacco, perhaps obesity and food, is the same. This is the lesson I take away. Put aside prohibitions. Emphasize treatment, education, and well-grounded public health approaches. Consider ways to reshape the offending industry and its products, much as was belatedly done with alcohol and what was sort of done with tobacco, though that's a more complicated issue. We're still in the middle of it. There's a danger that's consistent across all these cases. The path to political action stirs so much heat. Those of you who perhaps as a result of this class or before you came in this class saw political action is what we need around obesity and overweight. We've got to change the way America eats through government and politics. I'll say again, there's a danger. The path to political action in this country stirs so much heat, arouses so much activity, that the solutions almost always move beyond public health and emphasize the criminal realm. Medical wisdom almost always falls before this kind of demon imagery. The basic view is bad people are threatening American innocents, children particularly. Why shouldn't we discipline them? The history of American prohibitions offers a kind of eloquent answer. Criminalizing public health problems causes far more trouble, more pain, more suffering, more social dislocation than it solves. Let me stop with that, I think, warning of a thought. And if you've got questions or comments, I'm thrilled to take it up and do some back and forth. I think we've got about 25 minutes remaining, 20, 25 minutes. So let me hear what you think about this. And again, if those of you who did not sign up for a course in American history feel somehow cheated by this trip through alcohol, drugs, sex, and tobacco, at least a professor got up at 9 in the morning on Monday and talked about sex. So you got that going for you. Questions, comments, pushback, ideas? You're the shyest group of Yaleys I've ever seen.
Haven't seen much in the way of mass movements regarding obesity and nutrition issues. I was
Right.
wondering if that includes online movements and virtual communities.
Interesting question. If you couldn't hear, it's all right. No mass movements, no people in the street. What about? I'm taking as implicit your skepticism about what about us, we the people today, who exist mostly online? What about online movements and those kinds of changes? I mean, again, these are not blueprints. And when all of these alcohol, drugs, sex, tobacco cases took place, there was no significant online quote-unquote community. Apart from I'm going to be on ground I suspect some of you may dispute, and that's fine and even desirable. Apart from Obama's remarkable fundraising ability, in some way, and in some cases predicated or preceded by Howard Dean's ability to link people like you wearing orange hats 4 years ago in American politics, it's hard to think of a major American political movement that has been largely or even significantly situated online. I mean, most of what we do on our computers is still very private behavior. There's blogging and reading and some threads and discussions and so on, but actual urges to political action that take place online and then move into the public realm. The one example I can think of that actually, as I'm saying this and thinking aloud and perhaps dating myself, meaning in age, not in some weird fetishistic way. Self-abuse can kill you. I learned that from this from this study. The one example that may be contrary to that is movements for internet privacy, ironically. Those have moved around the net. I mean, Lawrence Lessig has become kind of, I don't know if you know the name, but he's kind of a rock star at NYU. He's a professor at Stanford who comes and gives talks about the importance of preserving internet privacy, and this guy gets 500 people turning out for his pretty dry, straightforward talk. So it's interesting. So that's one example, but if you guys have others, I'd be interested to hear them. I haven't written or thought about social movements that take place online. But it's hard for me to see in the public health realm, at least. I mean, there's lots of information about the effects and causes of obesity, overweight, and so on, the nutritional aspects. There's a lot of information about stigma and body image. I mean, this is an enormous issue of huge attention that no doubt gets taken up in here in some detail. But I can't think of sustained political movement in this realm that takes place online. So correct me if you all have other ideas. Good, one down. Yes. A lot of Obama buttons in here today. I can't imagine why.
So I have a question about the demonization aspect, and I was wondering if you looked into demonization of, for example, certain products or certain ingredients rather than the demon users. Like, for example, soda, like parents would look down on other parents giving their kids soda. It's the product more than like the actual kid drinking a soda.
Nice question. Again, if you couldn't hear, it's what about demonization of actual products, something specific that's produced? That, to me, falls generally under the header of demonization of industry or purveyors. So if you're demonizing, big gulps, as Kelly Brownell has tried to do, actually, these, gallon-sized drinks you can get and stick into your enormous cup holder in your SUV. There certainly are efforts to parody, poke fun at, and so on. And again, I think this realm is starting to take shape and take form. There is certainly a kind of well-established cultural criticism about the food industry and the ways it shapes our eating behavior. This sort of toxic environment frame that Kelly has done so much to pioneer has taken hold, at least to an extent. At the same time, there's also this very powerful personal responsibility or consumer choice view that says, don't point at my big gulp or what I choose as a consumer to eat. Keep the government out of my kitchen. I mean, there's basically this war of frames. And the initial frame was, I think, set pretty well by the food industry. American politics has a long history of the personal responsibility folks getting in first and framing the ground. Again, I suspect you've taken this up in here. I don't want to tell you things you don't know, but the idea that the food industry is going to be as disreputable as tobacco, or in the old days, and more specific to your question, the products they create is going to be as disreputable. It doesn't feel that way yet. There's a sort of slow food movement. There's this locavore. I mean, something is changing around the way we think about food, but I don't think it's anything like demonization. And that may be a good thing. Again, demonizing something is to portray it as all and everywhere and completely evil. As everybody I talk to, especially food industry groups, and Kelly and Marlene have heard this plenty of times too, we all got to eat. And we don't have to smoke, and we don't have to drink, and we all got to eat is the argument. But it's what we eat and how it's marketed and advertised to us that becomes the possible subject of political regulation. Yes, sir.
We largely emphasize the importance of actual policy change and the inefficacy of self-help programs, and lack of funding, and how really the main way we can get change is through policy. Would you possibly reconsider your statement on our path to policy if we could hop the demonization and the social movements as like the model from the Finnish government, how they went right to policy and it was pretty much all positive and no negative?
Lovely question, and again, I'll repeat it for those of you in the distant back, even sitting on the floor. Kelly gets a crowd as always. The basic thrust of the question is basically, what if we just skip demonization, as this gentleman said, hop right over it and go straight to policy action, and come up with the assumption being a kind of well-reasoned, rational, thoughtful way to regulate or prescribe or prohibit some practice that we find undesirable. Fantastic. I mean, I'm an advocate in this realm as much as I'm a historian and political scientist, and I spend some time, as these guys do in more detail, trying to figure out what policy solutions might look like. But you don't get in this country, and if nothing else I say today makes any impact on you, you do not get in American politics, especially on a national scale, from A, private behavior, industry says let us eat at peace and home, to policy solution without a hell of a lot of work and push and pull and blood and sweat and tears in between. In fact, the reason we go through these kinds of stages in such enduring Sisyphean, i.e. push the rock up the hill and they have it rolled down again, is because it's so hard to bring about significant policy change in American life. It's so difficult, in fact, that for the last 15 to 20 years, in the realm I know best, public health, more and more advocates have turned away from the usual policy channels, elective branches, write your member of Congress, here's a great idea for something I think is bad, make it happen. So many public health advocates have become frustrated and fed up with and recognize that the interest group society and so on makes it almost impossible to make significant change. They've turned to the courts. Because courts, with one swift stroke, with one decision of a judge, after many counter appeals and so on, can actually result in policy outcomes. Tobacco, I wrote about this in the piece you may or may not have read. I'll stop saying that, I promise, but I'm a realist. I'm Charlie Brown kicking the football, but I also taught a bunch of your elder siblings, as it were. In that piece, I try to suggest that tobacco, this extraordinary reshaping of the tobacco landscape, where now, again, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, people smoked in class. Now you huddle outside in doorways if you dare to smoke at all, enduring the disdainful wrath of your fellow consumers off not wanting to breathe in your secondhand smoke. In the tobacco realm, that enormous change, that huge settlement and so on, didn't come about because Congress said this must stop, or a president said this must stop. It came about because some legal actors got together, the attorneys general in the various states, and effected a dramatic change. So I love the spirit behind the question. Can't we just leave out all this bad stuff and do something good for we the citizens around reshaping the toxic environment or landscape of food and nutrition in this country? Yeah, it would be a glorious moment, but it doesn't happen that way. I mean, these guys have been in the trenches for more years than they probably want me to say around this. I learned this stuff from Kelly 8 years ago, and I've been working around and for obesity changes since. We've gone to Washington together. We've met with Hillary Clinton, among other things. These folks are regular presence in conversations with the people who hold the levers of power in Congress and to some extent in the executive branch. And not much has happened. You know how much since the Surgeon General, I might note George W. Bush's Surgeon General declared obesity an epidemic in 2001, so 7+ years ago, this statement. You know how much Congress has passed to reshape obesity and nutrition since then? Nothing, not a single significant bill, including the most recent Democratic-controlled Congress, where if they, one might say, pushed in the right ways, something might have happened quickly. It takes a long time, and it takes a lot of work, and so often it takes reaching way beyond where you want to be. The metaphor I like, and you probably heard this as a version before if you've studied politics here at Yale or elsewhere, metaphor is a battleship. to move a battleship, you don't just turn the wheel. You start turning and turning and turning, like I don't know exactly, I'm not a naval guy, but half an hour later, this thing starts to move. And the thing is, long before it started to move, you're already turning back because it's going to move way too far if you try to steer it like you normally steer a car. American politics and policy making is like a battleship around obesity and many other issues in public health. You turn and you turn and you turn and nothing happens. And then once you realize this thing actually turned, you've gone way too far. I don't know if that will happen in obesity and associated nutritional issues, but that's what happened with drugs, alcohol, sex, and to some extent, although not as badly, tobacco. Innocent people, particularly peoples on American margins, got badly demonized and badly hurt. A lot of pain was caused, a lot of social dislocation, because when you get this American policy-making apparatus in action, it runs right over so many people in its way. So I love the question. I admire the spirit behind it. 10 years ago, I would have said, of course, let's just change it together tomorrow. It's older, wiser, sadder, tougher, but still committed to the fight, such as it is. More questions? Yes? Another terrific question, thank you. Again, the last group I had a talk like this before was the food industry, and their questions were very different. And let's say not so sophisticated, and more the points were made with sledgehammers rather than inquisitively. I have to say I don't know. Sure, sorry, I'll repeat the question. It was a very intriguing one. I got lost in political scientist in thought. Sorry for those of you who desire more animation and action. The basic thrust of the question was, all right, you've talked about this as a kind of political or policy issue. What about all the other ways we can look at nutrition, issues relating to obesity and overweight? It's economic, it's psychological, it's anthropological, and you all in this class have taken up a bunch of those perspectives and avenues and so on. And the basic thrust of the question is, isn't food different? Because it touches all these different areas of life. I'll say first, I think most public policies most major policy issues have these various avenues and aspects to them. I mean, tobacco was also cultural and anthropological and economic, and I don't think there's something specific and special about food in that respect, right? I mean, the fact that I took a policy frame is partly because I'm a policy guy. It's partly because you all have, looking at the syllabus at least, and I'll be looking over some of your exams later, just kidding. But you already have mastered some of these other avenues and approaches. So in principle, I don't think food is in some meaningful way different, so the political scientists have to consider it in a different way. It feels to me that, like the analogy with alcohol and drugs and tobacco, and maybe even sex, that's a slightly odd one, but again, it's a private behavior. It feels to me like those also touch lots of different areas and aspects and ways of living in ways that really matter, and that one has to be, I'll take the spirit of your question to be, one has to be very careful with how you charge into regulating something that has so many delicate and important aspects. In my time, most recently here at Yale a couple of years ago at the Rudd Center, where these folks work, actually where these folks run the show, I really got educated about the stigma aspect of this by one of their colleagues who may have spoken in this class, Rebecca Puhl, who was a Kelly Brownell PhD student here. I really got a sense from Rebecca about how stigma and issues related to that, body image and so on, plays into this. And I think I'm, as an advocate and so on, much more careful and cautious about saying we got to get rid of these things that cause people to become fat. At the same time, there's also an implication in your question that it's so complicated. And shouldn't we sort of get things right, get all the science and all the nuance right before we try to make some public policy change? I'm going to take your two questions as kind of bookends. The food industry loves that kind of line. I think it's not you, but they love saying it's so complicated, it's so difficult, the science isn't quite right, we can't take some action before we know what the consequences will be. Look, this is a country. If there's anything true about our politics historically, is that we are a country of pragmatists. Franklin Roosevelt, after a similar economic time to this one, said, do something. Famously, he said, do something. Let's just do something. If that doesn't work, let's try something else. We are a people when we make policy, and we do it more slowly because there's so much interest group activity now. We've become a demosclerotic society. I love that word, from the demos, S-C-L-E-R-T-O-I-C. There's a free word for you today. Nobody wrote it down, but I'm pretending you did. Demosclerotic is a marvelous word coined by a friend of mine who's a journalist that basically means demos, we the people, sclerotic, like hardening of the arteries of the body politic. There's so many interest groups pushing so hard in so many directions and aspects, and in this case a very powerful food industry and its allies who are pushing so hard against political action, it's difficult to get anything done. At the same time, there is a spirit of let's try something. That doesn't work, let's try something else. Calorie menu labeling, let's get that on the menus and see what happens. Let's test it later, or let's test it as soon as we can. Ban trans fats, let's at least give that a try. So lots of policy options and possibilities. Absolutely, it's an incredibly complex and dynamic and confusing subject. But if we don't do anything, obesity rates, we know this from every projection we have, we're going to keep going up and up and up. So, yes?
So this should be the last one.
Okay, last question, sorry.
I was just curious, we talked a lot about the different challenges to making change, especially in this area. And I was wondering whether you anticipate the United States being kind of a global leader, or whether another country or perhaps another type of actor, such as industries or multinational corporations, will become kind of the trendsetter in the years to come.
Great question again. You all, I'm hugely impressed by the questions you've asked and appreciate them immensely as I do this opportunity to talk. Question was, if you couldn't hear it, is the U.S. going to be the global leader in this reshaping, perhaps from a regulatory or other political standpoint? A bunch of ways to do policy, by the way. There's regulating things, there's taxing them, there's prohibiting them, there's filing lawsuits against them, lots of ways to go. Are we going to be a global leader in this realm? And the sad answer is no. We're already a global follower by far. Most European countries, particularly those in Northern Europe, Scandinavia, are far ahead of us. If you haven't heard this yet in here, I suspect you'll hear chapter and verse. I mean, most of the Scandinavian countries, I think all the Scandinavian countries, plus some of the other Northern European countries, outright ban on high-fat, low-nutrition, snacky, junky foods advertising on TV to kids. You just can't do it. Can you imagine here the freedom of speech and most advocates have just abandoned that possibility, which, by the way, would be a pretty effective way of countering some of the enormous stream of messages that industry sends out to you all 10 and 15 years ago about what you should and shouldn't eat. Sugar smacks good, no, other stuff too expensive, hard to get, et cetera. So the idea that we'll be a global leader is dubious to me. One thing you touched on, though, the question about what about multinational corporations and so on. The way the U.S. could be a global leader is something we lead the globe in already, and that's so-called public-private partnerships, where you take the public sphere of government and you somehow marry it, connect it to a concerned, engaged, social entrepreneurial, if you will, private sphere. So you put together something where industry actually works with, if not government, at least think tank advocates like these guys, to reshape its activities and products. There's some, let me finish the thought, to reshape its activities and products. There's some indication that the food industry, in some of its better manifestations, and again, I know you'll get to that in here, has begun to work in a few cases with advocates to rethink the portion sizes, the level of fat, salt, sugar, and so on in its foods, the way they market and advertise to young people. There's some evidence that through some kind of public-private partnership, some good could take place. When I say we could lead the world in that, it's not because we're out in front as a government on these issues. We're not. We lag badly, badly behind most other advanced democratic nations. Japan, to give you one example you may have heard of, has required, I think they're still doing this, every single person in the country have something equivalent to their BMI measured and recorded. That's a kind of solution that wouldn't go, you couldn't do it in this class, much less the whole country, in our individualistic US. But I'll say for the last time, we are an individualistic country. We push back hard against government interference, and we resist intrusion into our private lives. And yet, in lots of public health areas, in the not so distant past, we've seen significant changes. Those of you who are going to work in this area, who are going to be advocates, make sure those changes are done with nuance, with subtlety, in ways that actually yield good results, not demonized and destructive ones. Thanks. This was a great opportunity. I'll talk again.